Hi, everybody. My name's Kimberly Maize, and I am a trauma resolution expert. I am the creator of the Trauma Response Syndrome model and a previous clinical social worker turned trauma revolutionary. I am proud to introduce my daughter and co host, Savannah Woodard.
Thanks, Mom. I'm Savannah, a second generation trauma specialist, a trauma informed coach, and care advocate, and together we are a new generation.
We are a mother daughter powerhouse duo determined to decrease the stigma of trauma and bring focus to healing transgenerational trauma through open conversations.
Please listen as we share our story on how we healed transgenerational trauma through radical self awareness and responsibility.
Because remember, when families heal,
Society heals.
thank you.
Thank you. Hello, and welcome back to a New Generation podcast.
Hi, everybody.
Today, we are doing our third episode of a 4-part series on boundaries. Last week, we did an introduction on radical boundaries. This week, we're going to be doing a deeper dive on a radical boundary within our own lives, and that is ending transgenerational addiction. So, Mom, would you like to talk a little bit more about radical boundaries in your life and what we'll be discussing this episode?
Yes, sure. I want to first say that, reiterate, we've probably said this before, but I want to make sure that we say it again, that we do not have an issue with the word addiction or the concept of the word addiction, because we believe that all trauma motivated behaviors can develop into behaviors that meet our needs as addictions do. And so we don't have an issue with referring to ourselves as addicts or having addictions. And if that isn't a safe word for you, then replace it with something else. We do not look at as addiction as a disease like the medical model, and people can fully recover. So I just want to reiterate that.
Thank you.
Sure. So last week we talked on the last week's episode, we talked about radical boundaries within our lives and how they showed up. We talked about our own personal boundaries within our life personally and our family system. And we're going to dive deeper into that. We're also going to touch base on other types of trauma motivated addictive behaviors. And so last week we touched on some of the internal radical boundaries that I made in my personal life regarding myself and regarding the family system. I've talked a lot about calling child protection services on my cousin because of I can't even describe how bad it was. But unfortunately, my cousin and her husband are an example of what using methamphetamine for decades does. And at that time, I was about 3 years into my recovery process, and I was very motivated by keeping the children safe before anything else. And so I had to call CPS despite the pushback and the anger that I got from my mother and her mother. And we don't involve outside sources. We don't involve the police in our family, which was definitely the story in my childhood, which is a good example of how family systems support people regardless of what they're doing. And that's very prominent in family systems. In my family, there were, drugs, crime, guns in the house that I grew up in, and everybody knew it. My grandma hid it, blamed the police, taught me to lie to the police. I started lying to the police about where my uncles were about 5 years old because I was sent to the door to answer it. And then my uncles would jump across the back wall and then they'd surround all that kind of stuff. is what I grew up with, and never was anybody, my aunts, my mom, nobody ever called the police or, thought, well, maybe this child is in danger because of what's going on. Never. And so one of the radical boundaries that I set was stopping drugs and moving from California, my hometown, to moving to Iowa and leaving my family system. When my friends were doing meth and other drugs, and they were, going to get it at my uncle's house with me in the car, I was starting to realize this is a big problem. I had my daughter, and no, that was before I had her, but later. And so I left, and that was partly part of the radical boundary that I set within the family, an internal radical boundary that I set. I actually did methamphetamine one time when I moved to Iowa with, of course, a guy I met in a bar, which will lead us into sex addiction issues later in the episodes. But and then I realized this is not who I'm going to be. So I did stop doing those drugs, and that was another internal boundary.
Was that in California that you're talking about?
No,
that was
one time when I moved to Iowa when we first got here.
Okay.
And I was engaged to her dad when I did that.
Which is why, we always say there's no shame when we're talking about trauma motivated behavior, because we've done all of it. So,
yeah, so nothing, there's a lot of things I've done, you've done. So no shame.
No judgment.
No judgment. And so that's one of, and we'll talk about, that's one of our missions, is when we decrease the stigma of trauma and radically accept everything we do out of it, and decrease the shame related to trauma motivated behaviors. Instead of like, I'm so ashamed that I did that, it's, of course I did that. What else would I be doing because of the trauma I experienced? And that's really important to recognize. And that's a strong motivation for what we do. And, so when another major boundary that I set was when I said that Savannah is going to go to treatment when she was 15, yeah. And she was on probation.
I was on house arrest.
And her probation officer literally was doing nothing. And I had to call her probation officer and say, I'm putting her in treatment, because she came home drunk. I'm putting her in treatment. And I did. And my family was like, that's not what we do. My mother was saying, why are you doing that? Because, she probably should have I was in treatment when I was young, but it was my aunt who put me there. My mom never did anything like that.
All three of us should have been in treatment at some point.
And my brother certainly should have been in treatment. Oh my gosh. So, but we do not do that. And when I told them that I was going to put her in treatment, I got pushed back, because our family system doesn't do those things. It protects. They would say that you're protecting us at all costs, but in reality, the trauma that passes down, because nobody protected us, really. Everybody should have called CPS, should have called the police, especially when I was young.
When I was young
and the way that the system was set up, I always had my grandma living with us when she was young, who was not capable of taking care of a child, but So, the social services and the hospitals and stuff, when I was released, they would say, well, if your grandma's living with you, then the child is taken care of, because I couldn't take care of her correctly. And that was not, we needed services. We needed people coming in and parenting and watching and making sure that she was getting her needs met, because my grandma couldn't do that. My mother didn't. So, that's reality of family systems, protecting, in quotes, each other through denial and um, looking as I was definitely taught that the police were the enemy. They were out to get us. We needed to lie, cheat, and hide and make sure that nobody knew what we were doing. Talk about toxic family secrets to protect people who were not taking care of children and doing drugs and dealing drugs and guns and that's family systems, right? And because we know no different, that's what we do. So that was definitely a boundary that I set that was way different than my family system. We'll talk more about sex addiction, the needs that gets met. And that was, I did drugs like an addict. I drank like an addict. The first time I smoked pot was when I was passed a joint at 5 years old by a member of a cult that was living at my grandma's house. And they gave drugs to all the children, LSD, everybody, drugs. I took my first drink at 8 years old after my uncle died, which was one of the most traumatic experiences I had. And we tried to smoke pot that my friend stole from her mom, but we didn't really know how. So, and then I started drinking consistently every weekend, stealing alcohol from the corner liquor store by 11. And then I drank, fifths of vodka every weekend for a very long time. But my motivation for behaviors was more about getting my worth from sex, from being able to feel like I mattered if I could please a young boy at that time or men later. And so that was very much the motivation for my behaviors. And I did drugs all through my teenage and early years. Hard drugs, serious drugs, meth, all the drugs. But I never was addicted in the typical sense of the word. I could live with it or live without it. I did it because that's what everybody else was doing, but I didn't crave it or steal for it. Nothing like that. I mean, I always had access to it because I dated drug dealers, but that wasn't really my strong addiction, was to sex and men. And then suicidal ideation was definitely an addiction, and we'll talk a lot more about that. That's really important. Now, suicidal ideation meets a lot of needs for people. It's not only about being an addiction, but in this episode, that's what we're going to talk about. And so when we talk about the one planet healing definition of addiction, is that we are taking back the word addiction and destigmatizing it as a normal behavior. That's what One Planet Healing believes, that all trauma motivated behaviors are understandable reactions to our experiences. And when we develop addictions out of that, it's an understandable reaction. So it's if you become physically, psychologically, mentally dependent on something, when you try to stop, you have adverse effects. So basically, trauma motivates your behaviors to act out and becomes an addiction. And when you try to stop that, you have adverse experiences. But it's also a completely understandable behavior, and you can learn to heal. I think that about covers the One Planet Healing definition.
Yes, well said.
Oh, okay. And the One Planet Healing definition of transgenerational addiction is that addictive behaviors are passed down to the next generations through modeled behavior, epigenetics, which is how trauma is stored in the DNA, and it actually changes how genes are expressed. And so that's probably what people really are talking about when they say that that addictions are family, like passed down through families.
Genetic.
What they're really talking about is how trauma affects our brain, and how how trauma affects epigenetics and how our genes are expressed, which means then we may be motivated more to act with addictions. And so transgenerational just means it's passed down through what we see, what we hear, what we learn, and how it affects the brain, and how it affects how our genes are expressed. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, Savannah, do you want to share a bit about your experiences with addictions?
Yes. And transgenerational addiction specifically, when I think of that, I definitely think of my grandpa's basement.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to think about, or to hear you talk about your childhood and some of the things that you did to protect the family and their addiction, which is definitely true for me and my grandpa.
Mm-hmm. And my mom did that for my dad, and yeah.
So my grandparents had a house when I was growing up, and specifically the basement was where my grandpa hung out. And it's interesting to think about how the two of them influenced transgenerational addiction. My grandma was much more passive. My grandma was passive, and my grandpa was much more hands-on with it, where my grandma pretended like it wasn't going on, that we weren't partying in the basement with my grandpa. And it's interesting to think, when I was really little and we would go over there, maybe before 10 years old, we would go over there. I would witness my grandpa and my uncle. So my uncle is 12 years younger than you, 7 years older than me.
Yeah.
And so growing up, he was much more like my brother, and that our friend groups, I hung out with people who were much older than me. And so our friend groups kind of overlapped. So I'm kind of going all over the place here, but let's go back to the beginning. So when I was, 10 and younger, I would see my Uncle Jake and his friends go down and play music with my grandpa in the basement. And I remember when I was really young, I wasn't allowed to go down there. And I didn't really know why. I just knew that it was like, no, that's where the adults are. And even Jake would say, no, you can't come down here. And as I got a little bit older, I started to catch on, that they were drinking down there, that they were smoking pot down there, that they were smoking cigarettes down there. And that I started to realize that that's probably why I couldn't go down there. And then as I got a little bit older, and I started to be able to go down there, one of my uncle's friends tried to give me LSD. And my uncle was like, no, like flipped out on him. One of his best friends flipped out on him. I guess they were ambivalent, but really good friend.
Still are.
Yeah. And he was like, no, she's a kid. Like, she's way too young for that. She can't take that. Absolutely not. And I remember that it kind of created some tension with them. But it was just 2 years later, and I was 12 when I smoked hash with the both of them. And I remember just hitting it one time. It was just the three of us, I'm pretty sure. Specifically me with this same friend. It was his same friend who, why was he allowed to come over? But and I remember that I took one hit of the hash and I just started spinning and spinning, and I literally threw up for like hours. They had to carry me upstairs. I was trying to hide it at first, and I was like dizzy and feeling like I was going to throw up. And then finally Jake asked me, what's going on? Like, are you okay? And I was like, I'm going to throw up. And they just laughed. Like, they thought it was funny. And I was like, I remember being so embarrassed. Like, this is a core memory for me. And I was taken up into the bathroom and I threw up, and then they put me in the bed and just left me there. And they went back downstairs to the basement. And, you know, it was the next year that I started smoking pot on my own. And I feel like that was one of the experiences that kind of took my innocence away. You know, like, it kind of, not consciously, but looking back, it kind of opened my eyes to what was going on in the basement, and like the potential of what was going on in the basement. Because then when I was 13, 14, Jake left. He had graduated high school. He moved out and went, you know, he traveled with fish and leftover salmon. He was just like partying and gone all the time. I took over the role of his friends. My friends then took over the same situation where my grandpa was an addict, an alcoholic, and an addict, and would get drugs from me, from Jake, and we would just party with him. And it was kind of like he was just one of our buds. Like, he was just, you know, my friends would be coming over and they'd be like, is Tim going to be around? You know, and it was just like part of what it was. Because my grandpa was cool. Like, he was the life of the party in the beginning. It was fun. And
it ended quite tragically.
I see now how actually tragic it was that he was partying with these 13-year-old kids and had been doing that for decades and decades and decades since he was a kid. You know, he's probably pretty emotionally stunted, and perpetuating his addiction. And it's interesting looking back, because during the party it was fine, and then at the end there was a lot of shame for him. You know, it was like towards the end of the night he would get so ashamed of what was going on. And it wasn't until I started getting a little bit older, you know, closer to graduating high school, that I realized, wow, yeah, this is a really sad scenario. But it was just what I knew, and so you're just kind of sad and depressed, and so you just keep using. And you know, we would use LSD with him and mushrooms, and you know, it was just so normal. And it wasn't until I started getting older, because my friend Indigo would stay at my grandpa's house when I started getting older, and her mom would like have to bring us toilet paper and things like that, because it was just like a party house. And my mom was incapable of taking care of me, going through her own thing. Her fiance had just taken his life, and you know, it was just so much going on. And
yeah, because I feel like we got the Habitat for Humanity house. I was working for the first time in like 6 or 7 years after being on Social Security disability. And I felt like we were trying to mend our little family unit, you and I. You know, you lived out in the Kelly house and had dinner together in your own room for the first time and all these kinds of stuff. And I felt like we were starting to heal our family unit. And then Chad took his life, and that was it.
That was the end of it. And I couldn't handle the understandable pain that you were going through, especially now I've lost my husband. And yeah, I just couldn't handle the emotional intensity, hearing you cry, the inconsistency. And I could use at my grandpa's.
Right.
You know, because that was traumatizing for me too. Now looking back, I didn't really realize it at the time, but now looking back, like I was attached to him. Like That was very traumatizing for me. Seeing you go through that was very traumatizing for me. And I didn't have any coping skills. And I knew that if I went to my grandparents' house, because my grandma had left my grandpa at that time too. So it was a free for all.
Everything went downhill then.
And we could literally party all day and all night. And that's what we did. And I barely graduated high school. I had to go to an alternative school. And, you know, my mom put me in treatment during that time, and it did help me, but it took, you know, a decade of setting boundaries with myself, radical boundaries over and over again to really get to the place where I am today. And, you know, that was the radical boundary. My mom sent me to treatment. And then I spoke a little bit in the last episode that I had a near-death experience while using drugs. I thought I was using MDMA. I was already using MDMA. Then I started using another drug that I thought was MDMA. It was actually heroin. And so I was using an upper and a downer at the same time. And that was kind of a wake-up call for me. But it was hard for me because using substances had been so normalized.
Oh yeah.
By my grandparents, because my grandma had to know what was going on.
Of course she did.
I mean,
she knew what was going on with you, Jake.
Well, and I remember my 15th birthday party. We all had a party in the basement and we were all wasted. And I came upstairs and I didn't know my mom was there. So I came upstairs and I knew my grandma wouldn't care. And then you were there and you asked me if I was drunk and I lied. I don't remember. Did you know I was drunk or not? Did you believe me?
I don't remember.
But, you know, it was just so like, not only were we doing it, but I didn't have to hide it really that much.
No, not from my mom. From me, you did.
Eventually, yeah. But it was just so normalized. So when I think of transgenerational addiction, I just think of like my grandma growing up the way that she did with her brothers, right? And raising her daughter, and then marrying a man who was addicted to meth at the time.
Yes.
Thinking that was okay. Then what?
And an alcoholic.
And an alcoholic. What would they assume would happen? I mean, it's all they knew, but it's like, of course, it's just going to be passed down and passed down and passed down. So it's just so normalized.
My mom accepted drugs and alcohol use completely as if that was just a normal part of our life.
It was so normal for her and for all of us. So it wasn't until my mom set that radical boundary. And then so I went to treatment when I was 15. And then I struggled for many, many years living with my grandpa. And then I moved into an apartment with my friend, not knowing she was addicted to heroin. She had been lying to me. I knew her boyfriend at the time was addicted to heroin. I didn't know she was addicted to heroin. And I moved into that apartment with them, and I would come home from work, and I was working like 12-hour shifts. And now looking back, I now know that part of that was to try to help me sober up. Like it was to afford my apartment, but I had somewhat consciously trying to get out of my grandpa's house because I knew what was going on. I was starting to realize what was going on. I was losing friends to addiction, like once a year, or to suicide. Like people were dropping like flies in my friend group. And I knew that I was struggling with it and that I wanted to get out. And it took years and years and years of trying to get out of that. And then I spoke, I think in the last episode, or maybe the one before that, or one of these episodes, about moving from my hometown and moving to Iowa City. And I was trying to get away from my roommate because we were struggling. I was basically telling her, I can't be friends with you anymore because you're a heroin addict and I don't want to get involved in that. I have a really hard time with drugs. I'm trying to get away from that. I got to get away from you. So I moved to Iowa City. And
which was about 2 hours away. And I quickly found a new friend group that all use substances. But I do feel like it was a different level in that that it wasn't the hardcore drugs. I wasn't using methamphetamines. Before that, I was using pharmaceutical methamphetamines. I was using a lot of things.
And I knew that I didn't want to do that again. So when I went to Iowa City, I definitely leaned towards psychedelics, smoking a lot of pot, and drinking, because I wanted to get away from stimulants, and I knew that that was destroying me, and that was somewhat of a conscious choice. And then I did that for a couple of years where I just drank a lot and I took a lot of psychedelics, and I do feel like that helped me evolve. I feel like it wasn't as traumatizing. I wasn't around my family. I wasn't doing it with my family. I was trying to find some autonomy. I had a fairly good friend group. I was trying to do yoga. I'd party all night and then wake up early and try and do yoga. Like, I feel like I was really trying to break a cycle, and I just didn't know what to do, know?
Yeah.
And I'm glad I got away from my family. I feel like that was a really good thing.
Oh yeah.
And then one of my friend groups, so a radical boundary that I set, that someone set with me, which led to me kind of taking space, was something happened with my friend group when I was in college, that I was hanging out with. I was working at Red Lobster, and I had worked at Red Lobster for a couple years, so I had a pretty good connection with all of the girls there. I felt like I was finally fitting in. I've talked about a lot in here that I struggle socially, being on the spectrum and being so traumatized that it was really hard for me to feel like I fit in socially. And I was fitting in socially, and then something happened. It was a miscommunication that the leader of the friend group completely cut me out and turned them all against me. And everybody hated me at work. I no longer had friends. A lot of my structure, like I was playing volleyball at a bar with them every Tuesday and Thursday, wasn't allowed to do that anymore. One of the girls changed her phone number and didn't tell me. Like, it was this huge thing over a mistake that I had made. And that was kind of a wake-up call to me, where I was like, wow, these are not the kind of people that I want to be around. Like, they'll just cut me out over this.
Right.
And it was like devastating.
I remember that.
And this keeps happening. This kept happening to me. Like, friend groups would cut me out and cut me out and cut me out. And I've learned a lot from that. I kind of know why now, but at the time it was just devastating. So I got a new job at a metaphysical store, and that was definitely a conscious choice, where I was like, I got to get the hell out of this situation where we're serving all the time and then getting fucked up every night, and serving during the day and just drinking all the time. And that's not what I want to do. So I got this job in a metaphysical store, and my whole life changed. Mostly because my boss wouldn't let me come hungover. She started realizing that I was hungover, and she literally said to me, knock that shit off or you're quitting. She said, you're a good girl. Knock that shit off or I'm firing you. And that was probably not her role at the time, but it really, really helped me.
Maybe it was.
Somebody, which is part of why I want to visit her. Side note, I do want to visit her because I feel like I want to thank her.
Oh, she loves you.
She gave me so much, and she made me the manager of her store. As I got sober, she really saw how much I was blossoming. I was doing so good at the store.
Wasn't an easy boss.
No, she was very strict, but I needed that structure. I had never had discipline in my life.
Right.
And she was a huge person who really, asserted radical boundaries. And I was like, okay, this is what I need. This is my value. Like, she recognizes my value.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
She let me open this sister store all by myself 2 hours away in this super cool meditation town. I met my first husband there, my friends, some of my friends. Oh, it was cool.
Yeah.
When I first got there.
Yeah.
Oh, it was
cool.
It was awesome.
It was cool when I was there too, but yeah.
So,
that's a whole nother story.
So then when I moved to Fairfield, I made a conscious choice. I've got to stop using drugs. I stopped everything, completely sober.
When you met Kenji and
I met Kenji. I had, I learned some energy work. I really started seeing my value of who I was as a person, and realized there was more to life than using drugs and alcohol and being the it girl, being the hottest girl at the bar. And that was what my whole life was for a really long time, was just getting ready and getting my needs met through the people at the bar, and then going home and feeling like shit.
Yeah.
I just knew that there was more to that, more to me. So I feel like people in my life during that time were setting radical boundaries to me. And although it was so painful at the time, Now looking back, that's truly what saved my life. My mom sending me to treatment, then me moving out of the town, then those girls kind of cutting me out, then me going and finding Jeet. It all was kind of in divine order. And I do really believe in that it was kind of leading me and leading me and leading me. And then, yeah, I met my first husband and everything changed. I got pregnant a year later. And when I got pregnant, I was already leaning pretty intensely towards sobriety, and I hadn't been drinking. I had been still using cannabis medicinally, and I was using caffeine very heavily. So I was still dependent on substances, but I was very slowly, constantly trying to become better. And then I got pregnant and I stopped drinking caffeine. I stopped drinking alcohol altogether. I stopped using cannabis. And there were a couple years where I was setting these internal boundaries, and my first husband was very disciplined. And so he really helped me, although it was a little forced and controlled. That's what I needed at the time, because he was like, you're pregnant with my baby, no substances. And I felt like I had to respect that. And I'm glad that I did. And I cleaned up and I did really well. And then as he got more and more sick, I've shared a little bit here, and not too much, but a little bit, that my first husband, Curtis, was chronically ill from pretty much the moment that I met him. His whole life, he got severely chronically ill a couple years into our relationship from Lyme disease and black mold poisoning. And the stress of that really brought back a lot of my trauma responses when I was a kid. I didn't really know how to handle what was happening with the two kids. He was in school. He would come home from school being very sick. And it was just really challenging environment.
Yes, very, extremely.
Yeah. And when we moved to Chicago, we used some cannabis because he was chronically in pain. And so it became an option again. And I hadn't been using, and I had not really thought about it too much. I was leaning more on alcohol because I didn't want to do something illegal with the kids around. It's illegal in Iowa. And so I was really trying to, be responsible. And so then we started using a little bit of cannabis, and I did fine with it. I didn't overuse it. I felt like I had taken a break from it. And still to this day, I've developed a healthy relationship with cannabinoids, that I don't have addictive tendencies. It's truly a medicine. Versus alcohol, it's very toxic for me as a person. It's really bad for my genetics and my body and what I've been through, and for my behavior. I can't quit. I can't just drink one. And so I was drinking a little bit after that. As he was getting more and more sick, we started using cannabis, and I was like, I don't really want to use too much of this because of the kids, and it wasn't legal for me. It was medical for him. And so I just was kind of iffy about it. And so I started drinking a little bit more, and the culture in Chicago is very much so alcohol driven, especially in privileged areas. Everybody goes out for a cocktail. Everyone's drinking wine. People are drinking beer at their kids' soccer games. Like, it's just a very affluent area. And a lot of times, I know this is a generalization, but in my experience, in very wealthy areas, they tend to drink more. Or it's normalized in a way where it's just like part of life. Maybe that's what I'm saying. It's part of the culture. That's what I'm saying. It's part of the culture. And so I started drinking a little bit more. There was a mom group that drank a lot of wine. And so I started drinking with them. I didn't really see it as a problem, but now looking back, it was definitely a way to cope. It wasn't really affecting my life, but it was definitely a way to cope. And then when my husband died, he took his life very tragically, very unexpectedly, very suddenly. And I had been enduring his chronic illness for nearly a decade with two small kids on top of my own trauma. And I fell apart. There's no other way of saying it. I completely fell apart. And we decided that I could drink for a year. I mean, I don't think we had a conversation about that, but I knew. Did we?
I said, I'm going to allow you to drink like this, but it won't last forever.
And I knew that inside too.
Because I went to where they were living to take care of the children, because I had the experience of my fiance taking his life, and I knew there's no way she would have been able to survive that on her own with two kids. And even though we had a very strained relationship at that time, I just felt like my role was to 100% go and take care of her and the kids, and allow her to fall apart and drink every day heavily. And I said, I'm going to allow you to do this for a while, but it's not going to be forever.
Yeah, and I had made kind of a decision internally too that I knew it was temporary. And my best friend Indigo came to visit me for my birthday, December 1st. So Curtis died on October 6th. And Indigo came for my birthday, December 1st. And she's one of those, you know, she's a real one. We've been best friends since 8th grade. And she's just like my sister. So when she says something, I take it very seriously because she's seen me through my best, through my worst, through everything. And she came to visit me and she said to me, Sav, you know, you can't drink like this forever. And I said, oh, I know. And she looked at me and she held my hand. She said, Savannah, you cannot drink like this ongoing. And I said, yeah, but I'm going to drink right now. And she said, yeah, girl, let's go. And so we went and drank. But that was a very, very real conversation that I had inside of me the whole time, because I drank another 9 months after that or whatever. Yeah, 9 months after that. But the whole time I knew, I think that's part of why I went hard, because I knew that I couldn't do it forever, that this was temporary, that I would have to be okay eventually for my kids. But in the beginning, I didn't even realize how much I was drinking, and probably didn't even realize how much I was drinking until I got sober.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, you were drinking all day long.
Yeah, I had to.
Mm-hmm.
So
and I didn't blame her, honestly.
What a tragic situation.
Yeah.
So
I wasn't a drinker.
No,
I feel like I just stepped in.
You did. You kicked ass, and you saved us, honestly. Saved the kids for sure. And me.
I know you didn't always think that. I hope you think that now.
I definitely think that now. I thought that the whole time.
You thought I had other motivations. Which I probably did, but the primary motivation was I wanted to show you I could be the mother.
Well, and I didn't know that. You didn't tell me that until later, after the divide.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it was my mom's radical boundary. So, you know, part of AA is, and I know AA is not for everybody. And honestly, I don't really work the program. It's just been really good for me at times to go there when I'm having a hard time, to go there for a couple times to find community. And then I usually find my strength. Some people have to go every day. Some people go once a month. Some people only go when they feel like they're going to drink, and that's okay.
I think it's a useful tool, especially in the beginning. I went to 12-step programs as well when I first went into treatment. And I felt like that was the only place I could go that I wouldn't act out. And so it's a useful tool, especially in the beginning.
Yeah.
For those who find it useful.
Yeah. And so, the reason why I brought that up, a big part of the process in AA is that you share your sobriety story. Mm-hmm. You say it over and over and over again. And honestly, that is a big part of what has helped me become sober, because I have still to this day, I'm working through it, but I have so much shame around the last time that I drank, because I've taken pride my entire life of being able to mask my problems. And when people know there's a problem, my friend Gabby and her husband saw me drunk, saw me throwing up and unable to drive myself. And the fact that they saw that is a big part of why I'm sober today. My kids can never see that. My husband today can never see that. I never want them to see that. My friend Gabby to see that. Indigo is probably the only person that's seen me like that I have no shame around. Just because, yeah, she's just that type of relationship. But yeah, so we had gotten into a fight, and I literally chugged a bottle of champagne in like 45 minutes on an empty stomach. I lied to my mom. I told her I was going to Gabby's, and I went straight to the bar And I had never lied to my mom like that before, except when I was a kid. My mom and I are pretty honest with one another. So for me to lie to go get drunk is a big indicator that there's a problem. So I went to the bar and I drank like three shots of Patron on an empty stomach in like 3 minutes. And there was a woman and her husband. I feel like this was God. There was a woman and her husband sitting in the booth, and I was, sobbing. I was just like falling apart, drinking tequila. And I saw her like watching me. I could tell she was like keeping an eye on me. And I just thought she was just keeping an eye on me because she could tell I was really intoxicated. And after they ate, they came up to me and she said, I used to have a problem like that too. And God is guiding you to AA. That's what she said to me. And I looked at her and I was like, I don't have a problem. I was wasted. I don't have a problem. My husband took his life. I won't be like this forever. And she just looked at me and she was like, honey, you don't know how many times I've told myself that. I hope you make it there. And that was like, I then called Gabby and she was like, are you okay? I'm like, no, I'm not okay. I need to come to your house. I think I might be an alcoholic, like there's something wrong with me. And she told me to come. And I don't remember anything but throwing up all over her bathroom. I didn't make it in the toilet. And her husband coming out and saying she needs to go home and them calling me a cab. And I don't remember getting home. I don't remember.
That's when you came home drunk.
Yeah. And I don't remember
falling down the stairs, and the kids were on the couch, and that was it. It was not going to happen again. Those kids were not going to be raised like that and see their mom like that. That was it. That was when it was done. I was like, nope, this is done. And, I was very motivated by protecting children, like I said before, and my child. And I called her in-laws and I said, Savannah needs to go to treatment. She's got to stop drinking, which infuriated Savannah. And I said, you're done, or something's going to happen. Something's going to change.
Yeah, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I don't really remember days after that, honestly. But yeah, so I went to AA and I got a lot of help from it, honestly. And there's been a couple times since then where my treatment, my recovery has been challenged. I've gone to AA since then. But really, I think the reason why I don't drink today is because I understand what needs I was trying to get met by that behavior. And now that I know how to get my needs met in healthier ways, I don't need to drink like that anymore.
Yeah.
So, and so much that I've learned from being sober and what I'm not going to allow with my kids, and the conversations that I'm going to have with them that are very honest and real. And I want to be a safe place for them to talk about using substances and feeling like they need to and things like that. I don't want it to be normalized and I don't want it to be sneaky. And so I've been, they're only 7 and 8, so we're not quite there yet. And they're well adjusted. So we have some time before they really start thinking about using substances. But it's a very, very common topic in our household. Me and my husband, we talk about this stuff. We see some behaviors already in my kids that could indicate them wanting to distract with things, teaching them to be present, feeling emotionally safe. And
they had a severe trauma in their developmental years. So
yeah,
we are, on top of the potential.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think, getting away from my family system, my mom setting radical boundaries, my friend Indigo setting boundaries, has really just led to who I am today. And I'm really proud of myself. And I feel
so proud of you too.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if I already said this, but I'm really excited. I'm 3 years sober on September 6th, of no alcohol and over a decade clean from stimulants. So it's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, it is. Good for you.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your story.
Thank you. So now that I've shared my story around addiction with substances, I think it's important for people to understand that, addictions can be to many different things, especially
yes,
if the needs if they're getting their same needs met as they do with any addiction. Could you share a little bit more on that?
Absolutely. When I reflect back on my trauma motivated behaviors, I recognize what needs I was getting met through what I was doing. And when trauma motivates our behaviors, we try to get, these needs met. And when our needs aren't met through these behaviors, because they give us a false sense of getting our needs met when trauma motivates behaviors, it continues to get reiterated and reiterated. And, it's not only the trauma that we experience in childhood or adolescence, it's how we re-traumatize ourselves because trauma is motivating our behaviors as adults.
Right.
So when I reflect back on myself and I think about, I used and drank very heavily when I was young, especially when I was an adolescent. And then later in my early 30s, I drank very heavily as well. But for me, it was trauma motivated sex addiction or behaviors, and chronic and debilitating addiction to suicidal ideation and behaviors. And both of those things were trauma motivated, and I was getting a false sense of getting my needs met through those behaviors. So we want to reiterate the One Planet Healing definition of addiction, and that is that we want to destigmatize and reduce the shame around trauma motivated behaviors, that everything that we do is understandable considering how we grow up and the trauma responses that we have to develop to try to get our needs met. And addiction is any physical or mental, emotional action, behavior, thought pattern that we try to stop, and it causes adverse effects, whatever those adverse effects may be. And so, when we engage in addiction behaviors, it increases ambivalent attachment issues, which is a trauma response syndrome model concept, and reinforces our internalized blame of self, which is another trauma response syndrome model concept. And those things together reinforce our addiction behaviors. But we can learn to get our needs met in more life-serving ways, and we no longer need to engage in trauma-motivated addictive behaviors. And that's how One Planet Healing views addiction.
So, as we both know, these addictions can be really dangerous. So, I'm wondering, why do you think people continue to engage?
Well, over the last, 2 decades of my own introspection on my own trauma motivated behaviors and working with so many other people impacted by trauma, I've identified the top needs that people are trying to get met with trauma motivated behaviors.
Listen up, this is so important.
Yes. So if we think about the why people are doing what they're doing and how our trauma responses motivated by unresolved trauma, right? Then we look at what are the needs that people are trying to get met. Now, there's lots of theories that talk about needs that people are trying to get met, but when we think about it from the perspective of trauma motivating behaviors, then those needs aren't life-serving. The needs that we're trying to get met are ways to, for instance, we're gonna use suicidal ideation and behaviors and break down the needs that I was trying to get met from an addiction perspective, because we can become very addicted to suicidal ideation and behaviors, and there's reasons for that. And, suicidal ideation and behaviors also meet other needs for other reasons, but these are the top trauma motivated behaviors. And we hope that you tune in. We're going to break down these top trauma motivated behaviors in each episode. And so that will be in the future if you want to learn more. So if you look, so we're going to reflect on trauma motivated behaviors of suicidal ideation. So I spent 2.5, 3 decades, probably at least, in that darkness. That's what I call the state of mind that I was in when trauma motivated my behaviors. And I acted out from that dark place to try to get my needs met. And so I spent all of my time ruminating about taking my life and suicidal ideation. And that was my number one go-to if things were just stressful for me. That's where I went, that I'm going to take my life. And so that was my main coping skill for most of my life. So if we think about trauma motivates behaviors, in the most is that we're trying to avoid our original pain. Mm-hmm. So we look at what is keeping us from thinking about, dealing with, processing the original trauma that we experienced. And so suicidal ideation, if we're thinking about suicide all the time, that allowed me to avoid anything else. Right. And that may seem strange for people. It's like, well, why would you thinking about taking your life? Well, that was actually allowed me to avoid, which is one of the main trauma motivated behaviors, is avoidance. And what we do in our lives to avoid the original pain is oftentimes addiction. So that's one, is avoidance. So if I was thinking about taking my life, I didn't have to think about the original pain that caused me to want to take my life. I also got a very strong false sense of control. And it wasn't really all false, because when we think about one of, number 2, and these aren't in any particular order necessarily, I'm still kind of thinking that through, but
depends on the person.
Yeah, that control is one of the top motivations for behaviors. If I took my life, then I had control over myself. I decided when I was going to die. I decided how, I decided when, and that gave me a sense of control, internal and external control, over what was going on in my life. When I felt total inner chaos, thinking about I had the control over when I ended this, it was a very strong motivation to continue to do that. Another very strong motivation for behaviors is maintaining family systems. That's top 3 for sure. So if you think about, we've talked about roles in previous episodes. My role in my family system was the quote mentally ill one, the crazy one. And that's the role that I was trying to maintain to allow my family system to stay the same. So I would act out of my role as the mentally ill one to maintain my family system. And by being suicidal and emotionally intense and trying to get my needs met that way, that maintained that role. And, remember, none of these behaviors are anything to be ashamed of. I had no way of getting my needs met. And the, doing this gave me a lot of needs that I felt like I was getting met. And um, I could not be a well adjusted person in my family system to maintain the dynamic. I was always trying to get my mother's attention, love, anything from my mom, and she wasn't capable of giving it to me. So I was trying to get her to be who I needed her to be by maintaining this role, which, when I stopped acting out of that role and wouldn't allow her to see me as a crazy person, that that's not derogatory language. That's literally what I was called. um, then our dynamic completely changed and our family system shifted, and I wasn't part of that family system for a long time because I had to be the crazy one to maintain it, because my mother wasn't ever going to look at her behaviors. It always had to be me. So my suicidal ideation and behaviors was to maintain my role to maintain my family system. Trauma motivates behaviors. It was also to maintain a trauma bond I had with my mom, always trying to get my needs met with my mother. And so the suicidal ideation and behaviors was a way to manipulate her, to try to get her to pay attention to me, to try to get her to care. I never felt like anybody ever cared about me. I wasn't shown that. I she was not capable of caring about me. I always say my mom's missing the mother gene. She just doesn't have a mothering gene in her, and that creates very strong trauma responses to try to get her mothering, and it consumed my life, and I didn't know it. What was going on. I was going to the hospital, psychiatric ward all the time. So then that would be being seen, validated, or heard, another very strong motivation for behaviors. So that was a way that I was trained to be seen. Ever, would somebody please see me? If people are chronically suicidal and have those behaviors, because sometimes the drive was so strong that I would take action. And I was in the hospital, I don't know how many times, 30, I don't know, 40, I don't know how many times, because being in the psychiatric hospital also meets a lot of needs. How many needs do we get met in the psychiatric hospital? A lot. We get a sense of community, we get a sense of people. No, now don't get me wrong, going into the psychiatric hospital was extremely traumatic. But once you're there, you also get to avoid your reality. You don't have any responsibilities. People come to see you. People, nurses sometimes treat you like you matter, because you don't really get your needs met by going there, but it feels like it. Definitely. So we get a lot of needs met by going into psychiatric hospitals. We get a lot of needs met by having chronic suicidal ideation and behaviors. And it can be very, very addicting. I spent all of my time writing suicide notes, planning my funeral, what flowers I would have. I mean, it was a total avoidant addiction behavior. Let's see what other needs I was getting met. I was always trying to get my mother to hug me. So another physical touch is a strong motivation for behaviors. And because we don't get our physical touch needs met in appropriate ways when we're kids, it's a strong motivation for behavior, which also was a strong drive for my sexual addiction, was trying to get those connection needs met And the only way I knew how was through a sex, which then re-traumatized me because I really didn't want to be doing that. So our trauma-based needs that we're trying to get met also re-traumatize us completely. So I can't think, is that the last?
That's most of them if you didn't get all of them.
Yeah. So if you break it down and look at it from that perspective of what needs am I getting met through this suicidal ideation? Because for a long time, for up until I was in my 30s, I had no conscious awareness of anything I was doing. This wasn't like, oh, I knew consciously I was doing these things when I was in that dark space. Not at all. I just completely acted out of trauma, and I was so dissociative and fragmented. I didn't have any idea what I was doing ever. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to go and, have suicidal ideation and it'll do this for me. No, none. This was once I started to understand and reflect back on my life, because when I began my trauma recovery, that's what I did, was why was I doing all those things that I was doing? And that's how I learned about trauma, how trauma motivated behaviors. And then it was reinforced because I've seen so many hundreds and hundreds of people doing the exact same thing, trying to get their needs met. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is the needs that people are actually getting met. And so,
and we have to remember that those of us who have endured trauma, our needs are different than those who are well adjusted.
100%. That's key. We have, like I said, a lot of people theories talk about getting needs met, but those aren't the needs that traumatized people have. They're completely different than people who securely attached. We aren't driven by the same Maslow hierarchy of needs. Trauma trumps that, cuts it right in half. Maslow didn't take traumatized people into consideration. His research pool was like, white, well-adjusted men. It's not accurate. So just, that's a thing to think about of why am I doing what I'm doing? Once you become aware, first step is becoming aware, then take action. So Savannah, would you like to share a little bit about the needs you were getting met through your addictions?
Sure. So I know I've mostly talked about my addiction to substances in this episode, but I want to talk about the most difficult addiction for me to end. Was definitely me feeling responsible for your emotions within my caretaker role.
Tell us more about how that was an addiction.
Well, it met the same needs as any other addiction. So just like you broke down with suicidal ideation, I'm going to do that with my caretaker role so that you can see how it meets the same needs as my addiction to any other substance. For me, like you had said, one of the top motivators, trauma motivated behaviors, is avoidance, and especially avoidance of original pain. I feel like it was really difficult for me to recognize the severity of my trauma until even just the last 5 or 10 years. Mm-hmm. It was so normalized for me that I didn't recognize that it was even different or harmful to me. And then it took me even longer to recognize the impact. I wasn't in a position where I could just break down and see the impact. And I think that's one of the reasons why I fell apart so in such a big way after Curtis passed away, was because I had never really allowed myself to fall apart. I had been just keeping myself together, masking. And I never had been the focal point of anything because I was such a caretaker. My mom's main role growing up, and we talked about this, I think episode 3, about your your role of being mentally ill, perpetuating my role of being a caretaker.
Absolutely.
And because our needs were getting we were getting so many needs met through that family system, it just kept going and kept going and kept going.
False needs.
Yeah.
But their needs, that's trauma motivated. Yes.
Yeah. So let's break this down a little bit. So going back to the avoidance and the original pain. So like I said, not only could I not face how my trauma had impacted me, that would mean that I also had to face my mom and her behavior, everything that my grandparents had done to her. I couldn't even face that yet.
Triangulated.
The triangulation with my grandma, which we did talk about in other episodes as well. And just face the music of what my childhood actually was, seeing my mom. So everything that you just heard that my mom described about her suicidal ideation, I got the brunt of that.
Yeah, she had to live through that.
I lived through it. I had to survive through that. And so therefore, I tried to control it. That's another need that I was getting met through my caretaker role. Absolutely. I had to find some sort of false sense of control in order to believe that my mom wasn't going to die. And I would do anything and everything to avoid the fact that my mom was suicidal, to then try to find a sense of control, which you can see the disconnect there of like, how am I avoiding it and trying to fix it at the same time?
Ambivalent attachment issues
to perpetrator.
Yeah.
My mom being my perpetrator at the time and me being the victim as a child. And now as an adult, obviously I recognize we're both victims in this situation, that my mom was going through suicidal ideation to be able to get her needs met. But as a child, I was automatically the victim. Just to clarify that out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I used control behavior so much to the point that even though my mom started her recovery journey when I was 13, which we've talked a lot about in past episodes, I could not radically accept that she was getting better because I had to be in control. So I continued to try to get my needs met through that same caretaker role, even when my mom didn't need it, and it caused more of a detriment to our relationship.
Oh, yeah.
So I had to first get those needs met in a self-serving way before I could eliminate that coping skill. So that's another need that we get met, of just coping with something, being able to survive through it. Maintaining my family system, like I had just said, that was another need that I was getting met. I literally did not know how to talk to my grandma when I decided to stop being a caretaker. And like my mom said, it was a very conscious choice eventually. It took a long time to get here, but eventually it was a very conscious choice of, I am not going to caretake my mom anymore. That is not an option, which is what led to the divide, the ultimate boundary, was that I had to completely stop that role and that behavior. I kept saying, I have to learn how to function without caretaking my mom. And that was so hard for me. And then my grandma, our dynamic really changed because we weren't triangulating anymore. Our family system dynamic had changed entirely. My grandma didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. My mom didn't know what to do. It took a few years of transition to really be able to get our needs met in a self-serving way. Physical touch. I feel like I didn't realize this at the time. And now looking back, I can recognize that there was a lot more physical touch from my mom. My mom is very avoidant, and we've talked about that quite a bit in other episodes. And so that was very inconsistent. I feel like my mom was nurturing and loving sometimes and then very avoidant other times. And that inconsistency made me feel like my caretaker role could control that in a way that I would be able to get those touch needs met if I did a good job at saving my mom.
Yeah.
And, you know, there was a lot more affection during that time. I'm sure you dealt with a lot of guilt after doing that. And so you were probably far more affectionate after your suicide attempts, more connected to me and things like that.
Well, the avoidance was probably more to do with a man or men, or what was going on with men, that made me avoidant rather than you, even though it felt like it was towards you. I don't feel like I was ever consciously ambivalent towards you, although, I mean, because of my own trauma, I probably was, but the avoidance was probably more that I was triggered by someone else, which then made me suicidal. And then once that hijacked or whatever minimized, I was able to reconnect to you. Yeah.
Well, and I just remember like a lot of hugs in the hospital.
Oh yeah.
I remember like, you know, bringing you a hospital bag and getting a hug.
Oh yeah.
You know, or like if I would clean the house or what, you know, if I would do something in a good way, then I would, like, I feel like maintaining my caretaker role
yeah.
allowed me to have more physical touch because
Sure.
I was rescuing you
Oh,
and
sure.
saving you. Um,
Sure.
so yeah, I feel like I got a lot of needs met, but those are the ones that stand out the most for me in my caretaker role. And it may be a little bit difficult for people to recognize, okay, how is maintaining a caretaker role an addiction? And that's why we're really breaking down. So all of these needs that we're talking about, control, avoidance, maintaining a family system, physical touch, all of these different ones, those same needs get met with any addiction. And that's what we're trying to make clear here, if it wasn't, that those needs are what drive the behavior. And so we want people to recognize, because a lot of people come into our offices saying, I've dealt with this for a really long time, and I've worked with therapists, I work with doctors, I take medications, and they just won't go away. I'm still addicted to food, or I still drink alcohol, or whatever that may be. And so it's really important that we recognize every behavior. Can I say that? Every behavior
can be.
Yeah, every behavior can be resolved if we understand what needs are getting met. And so when people come into your office and they're like, well, I want to stop drinking and I can't, and I don't know why, and I'm mad at myself because I want to and I can't. For us to be able to say, okay, well, what needs are you getting met? Why are you doing that? Let's talk about that first. Let's let go of the guilt about drinking for a while. Let's not even talk about it. Drink every day. We're not going to talk about it for a while unless you need to.
That's true.
We don't need to talk. We don't need to focus about that right now. That's not the main concern. I hear you. You want to quit drinking in the next 30 days. Okay, let's talk about what needs you're getting met by drinking. Let's try to get those met in the next 30 days. And then let's talk about medical detox or whatever you need to do. And I feel like that's far more successful in recovery than just, quit drinking and tell yourself that you don't need to drink anymore.
And then work.
Yeah, because we have all these core beliefs based in that addiction. So,
and that's really hard and difficult for people who assist in recovery to hear, that the people that you work with are going to continue to drink and use and have trauma motivated addictions long into the process of recovery. They're going to come and meet you and talk with you, and they're going to be, have addictions. And when that's the focus, it doesn't work, because first, it's not your responsibility to tell people whether they should or shouldn't drink. That's their decision. You can share with them that their drinking is the reason why they're feeling A, B, and C, and what needs they're getting met. But ultimately, it's their decision. This is harm reduction. This is, understanding what needs the addictions meet. And, we're going to talk with them for a long time before they're ready to not maintain their family system roles through addiction and trauma bonds. It's very extensive of why people have addictions, and just focusing only on the addiction is not going to work. So being comfortable in a space where people are continuing to engage in trauma motivated addictions is a place you gotta be when you're working with people impacted by trauma.
Yeah. And, I think that's great for our actionable step. We like to share actionable steps at the end of every episode. And for this one, for people who are struggling with addiction, I think the main thing to focus on is what needs are you getting met through that addiction, and how can you get those needs met in a more self-serving way. And if you need help with that, we're here to help support you. We want to collaborate and help people understand, and continue to listen to our podcast here, because we'll continue to share more and more about that.
Yes.
Yeah. So just to summarize today, we spoke a lot about transgenerational addiction. Ending transgenerational addiction was a radical boundary that we have placed throughout our family system together, her stopping it through me, and now me stopping it through my children. And next week, we're going to do our final episode 4 in our 4-part series on boundaries.
Wow.
And we're going to be talking about the ultimate boundary and leading up to the divide. So if you're interested in that, Stay tuned every Wednesday. We're on SoundCloud, YouTube, and Spotify. Thank you so much for joining in today, and we really appreciate you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.